So I wanted to say hello to one of my musical heroes and to the lecture couch at the Red Bull Music Academy in Tokyo. His name is Robert Rich, and we were listening to some of his stuff just now. That was Perpetual.
Yep, that's the sequel to it's an 8-hour piece that's based on the sleep concerts like the one I'll be playing tonight.
And tell us about these sleep concerts.
Here we go. Get that really, really quiet.
Guess we're gonna have some ambient bed music
that's
for
okay.
the entire talk.
Well, the sleep concert started. The first one was when I was a freshman in college around 1982, and it was in January. And I had been trying for at least a year or so to figure out how to define a musical direction for what interested me in my musical voice, my direction. And the things that interested me were how music could be used as a ritual device or a shamanic community building tool, and thinking about the ways that music might have started archaeologically in the earliest, earliest memories of human consciousness as language was taking shape in our brains. It's most likely that forms of communication were coming out in ways with early musical forms as well as with words. In Paleolithic sites, there's instruments that include stones that were obviously hit and tuned, and there's bone pipes with holes in them that are hollow. One of the oldest human musical instruments is from the bone of an ostrich, and it's a flute that goes back about 30,000 years. 30,000 years, which is, about when Cro-Magnon man was probably intermating with Neanderthals in Europe, So
we're really starting from the beginning here.
Yes. My question then was how do I define what my purpose is as a musician? I was 18 years old, intellectually inclined, in college, wanting to change the world, wanting to do something with my life. And although I never went to art school, what I always thought should happen in art school is that people should be encouraged to define their purpose. And that as soon as a direction has a clear reason, it has the why, then the how follows. And so I was looking for the why. And after thinking about what other people had been doing with duration, with ritual, with trance and repetition in long form of music, I thought that there was this idea that came to me that I could play all night long and invite people to come and bring a pillow, a sleeping bag, and encourage them to dream with the music.
Why sleep, though? Obviously, most performers want people to very actively.
It's a really good question.
Hear their music,
and there's probably layers to that. I think one ironic or self-defeating part of it might have been that I was inclined towards very slow, deep music and film and everything. My favorite art was minimal and sparse, and I can talk later about why I think that's important. But a lot of other people would find it boring, and I would find that the boredom factor was one of the distinguishing things of what made me interested in something and what made other people not like it. And so I thought, well, how do I get people to be in the same place for a long period of time without expectation of surprise, without expectation of entertainment, so that they could start looking inside of themselves and find what's interesting inside? I think for me, the realization was that differentiation between boredom and entertainment was that I always had a whole world of things to explore, and that when a stimulus was very rarefied, I would explode with ideas, and other people would just get really bored and go off and want more stimulus. And so the sleep idea wasn't so much that I wanted them to be asleep to my music. In fact, you don't sleep as deeply in a sleep concert. You sleep rather poorly. There's many reasons for that. One is that physiology becomes activated, and just your own heartbeat, your breath speeds up when other people are in the room with you. when you're alone, you tend to relax. And so that causes you to sleep less well as well. The other thing was simply to get people to be in the same place for a very long period of time so that they could start experiencing what music can do over a very long period. Because I have a short attention span. I wander around. I can't sit still for more than about 20 minutes. So this was a way to just give people permission to not concentrate, to give people permission to doze off, and to see if I could create a context for something magical or something communal.
When you first did it, was it what you expected? Did you get exactly the sort of, oh, this is exactly what I thought this was going to be, or were there surprises?
The very first one was hard to say I knew to expect. It was a total experiment. And it was in the lounge of my college dormitory. It was about this big, and it had, a natty carpet and, an old piano in it, and about 12 or 16 people showed up. I knew about half of them. I was amazed that there were at least, 8 or 9 people that I didn't know there. And it was free. And it had a thick atmosphere, and that was what I was looking for. What I couldn't know, and what I still don't know entirely, was what the audience was experiencing. And that's the mystery of consciousness, isn't it? The fact that we don't really know what each other thinks or experiences. And so for me, that has been one of the most interesting puzzles, because my experience of giving a sleep concert is probably very different from the experience of the people experiencing it.
Obviously, this is very obvious. You're working.
Yes.
And they're not,
exactly.
so to speak.
Yeah.
What is it like for you specifically, doing a sleep concert?
It's usually there's a point for the first 40 minutes or so, it's fairly active, and I'm just performing, and I'm playing and listening to notes. Then there's a certain point where it gets very, very slow and quiet, and the room gets thick, and the atmosphere gets sort of heavy. And then it's interesting, because I go into a place where I'm riding this very slow wave of energy, but then at a certain point I get tired and I get bored as well. So there's things where I'm trying to keep a continuum, a thread going, so that the experience is fluid, and yet I need to maintain the sort of level of concentration that becomes difficult for me, especially when I'm tired. So often it means, getting up, going into the back, grabbing a tea, going to the bathroom, coming and going more often. And then there's these periods of magic and concentration, and then periods where I'm just trying to keep it going, is the very frank and honest answer to that.
What type of gear are you bringing to these things? I know you play, obviously, you're using synths. You also have in the past played flute as well.
I have all those things here. A lap steel guitar with loopers and homemade flutes that are using PVC pipe, basically sprinkler pipe. And then a laptop running Ableton Live like everybody else in the world. I have a funny story about Ableton with that, but I was at...
What is that story?
We were at Detroit Electronic Music Festival. This was about 2008, I think. And Robert Henke, who is the person who created Ableton, he conceptualized it. He doesn't work for the company anymore, but it was his brainchild. He goes under the name Mono Lake as his music. And we were backstage while I think Juan Atkins was playing, and we were just noticing that Ableton was everywhere. Everybody had a Mac laptop running the same software at Detroit Electronic Music. And Robert was feeling a little smug, and he puts his legs up and he goes, "I think we have achieved 100% market saturation." And this is not a very good thing. Where do you go? But yeah, it comes in really handy, because what I can do then is create these long, evolving textures that are 40 minutes, an hour long, and I have them all as essentially, full-length files, and I mix them in and out, and I play it. So I have access to hundreds of layers. I could probably give a concert for 2 days if I could pull it off. But the idea is that it allows me a kind of a turntable or DJ setup with 24 CD players, essentially.
With the playing of live instruments, do you hold that back for 30 or 40 minutes while people are sleeping, or do you go directly into that?
Well, no, it comes and goes in waves. Usually the first hour is more active, and there's one of the big influences in my music is Indian classical music, raga, and especially the beginning part of a raga, the alap. And although I'm not a formal student of Indian music, I've been around it a good part of my life in the Bay Area. San Francisco area has the Ali Akbar School of Music in the north, and a large South Indian population where I live in Silicon Valley. So I have this wonderful access to the music of Carnatic South Indian music and the Hindustani North Indian classical. And so that quality of drone and solo instrument and the way that modes are used in Indian music is a strong influence. And I use that as a way to sort of slowly weave a line of thought into the clouds of sound that then take over. And so it's the flute and the guitar become like a voice, and it's just very slow.
So you grew up in San Francisco as well.
South of there, yeah.
Tell me, this is quite heady stuff for someone just entering college to be grappling with these questions already that you were just talking about earlier. How did we get there? How did you get to that place where you were already thinking about these things?
Well, someone in my age group was a little kid during the 60s, and that was a big factor. I didn't even know that it was at the time. I didn't know what psychedelic meant when I was 5, but it turned out the Grateful Dead were practicing in a garage behind a cemetery where I was backing. So they were about 200 meters from my backyard was the garage where the Grateful Dead were practicing in when they were called the Warlocks. And Ken Kesey's bus was parked 2 blocks up the hill on Perry Street. And there were riots going on at Stanford University in 1968. And as a 5-year-old, I'd ride my bike over there and really enjoy seeing all the naked hippies hanging around Lake Lagunita. First time I saw naked adults, cavorting, and it was, of course, who's not going to like that, right?
So I guess when that's normal, this is,
it was,
yeah.
For me, it was very pleasant. And so one of the nice things about the San Francisco Bay Area is a lot of diversity and a lot of openness to all types and all sorts of ideas. And one of the things that really started shaping my musical language was a radio station called KPFA in Berkeley that's listener-sponsored, very left-leaning, free radio. And during the 70s, the music director was a fellow named Charles Amirkhanian, who himself is a respected sound poet. And he was bringing all sorts of amazing composers around and exposing people to this new world of minimalism and tonal avant-garde music.
When you say tonal avant-garde, what does that mean exactly?
To distinguish it from people like Milton Babbitt or Stockhausen, which is more event-based and much more intellectual and more mathematical. People like Lamont Young or Terry Riley or Pauline Oliveros, Anea Lockwood, were doing this magical, slow, focused, deep listening was the phrase that Pauline Oliveros coined. And this idea that comes from minimalist art, that art doesn't have to be about the artist's ego or the statement of changing, the shape of art. Art can be about changing the shape of the person experiencing the art. And it can be pointing away from the art itself and pointing back towards the experiencer. So the beauty to me about minimalism was it's not about repetition. I don't use this phrase the way most musicians think of it in terms of Steve Reich or Philip Glass, Terry Riley, this da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But minimalism in the sense of an artistic aesthetic of quietude and creating a kind of evanescent, vague experience which disappears when you try to touch it. And what that does when you confront this art, you confront yourself, and the art points back to you like a mirror. That idea was very, very strong for me. And I think with the kinds of composers that Amirkhanian was bringing, people like Terry Riley, who is just a huge light and a beautiful energy of a person. I mean, he's just this big-hearted guy. And his music shows that. It shows this love and ecstatic feeling for the universe, you know. So I think when I refer to minimalism, I talk first about the movement, which would be, you know, this tonal, a return to tonality, and then the other half of it is art that points back to the listener. The return to tonality is very interesting because I also was moved by that to explore microtonal composition, and that was also an influence from Terry Riley, Lamont Young, and all sorts of other, you know, there's Harry Partch was a composer, an American composer who was born in 1902 and died in 1974. And he created a whole tuning system of 43 notes per octave and built all of his own instruments and created these events that were like Chinese opera mixed with Greek drama with this crazy music. And he was a complete outsider, but his music was hypertonal, even though it was extremely threatening to people. Very, very strange music. The idea of finding new language within chords and within melody, and not rejecting the way that emotion can be brought forth into music. That art music doesn't have to be cold; it can be beautiful, and even, you know, that creating art that has gravitas or has importance doesn't mean it has to be intellectual or fully, you know, austere or you know, dealing with only the shadows of the world. It can also encompass these elements of life and light.
It can also encompass life, because I
and
think
life encompasses death, doesn't it?
Of course.
It's a full circle, yeah. And so that aspect of being complete is very interesting to me.
One of the other things that you've said in the past that's been an influence on you is just sounds in general. Growing up, frogs, the sound of frogs, or crickets, or the wind.
Absolutely, and I think the frog, I've said many times, the frogs taught me polyrhythms. The way I hear syncopation is from the western tree frogs, what we'd call the spring peepers. There is an aspect in my music which is a desire to return to a kind of Eden. And it's a metaphor for me, which is not an Eden in the Bible or Eden in a garden, but it's a metaphor of Eden to a place of connection within the self. But nature for me is definitely an aspect of the way I hear sound and the way I hear music. I should probably back up a step and say I grew up in a household where my father was a jazz guitarist, and so he was into the West Coast cool school of like Stan Getz and Barney Kessel. And I grew up hearing that music as being very Caucasian. And so come around the 60s, and for me it was all about Sun Ra and Chicago Art Ensemble and you know, it's much more, you know, aggressive kind of weird stuff, Ornette Coleman. But my grandparents had this place that they had built a little house on a property with a creek running through it back in the 1920s. And my grandparents passed away in the 1960s, and sometime around 1977 we moved to my grandparents' place to take over the property, and I was helping to keep the garden up and things. And that's where I really found my language in the garden there. It's very emotional for me, actually, because truly, my first recordings were of the creek that went around a big oak tree, and that recording ended up being the base of a piece that is on my first album called Oak Spirits, and it was quite literally an improvisation on modular synthesizer and a creek. So And I was trying to find a way to use the sound of nature to be its own instrument, not to be an accompaniment to something that was like, well, what became a horrible cliche with this god-awful relaxation music that was happening in the 80s. And I
It's quite interesting that you always draw that distinction, because I think a lot of people, listening to some of the things that you do, could very easily just lump it in there.
Absolutely.
And you're always very adamant that
I am,
that's
and
the
I think
other stuff.
If you hear it, you hear it. It's like you just know what I mean. Because for one thing, is avoiding that cloying triadic harmony that just sounds like you're imposing something upon the.
You will relax.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. So it's a funny thing, and it's like the fact that I would be using a vocabulary which is just inches away from something that turns my teeth on edge, that is ironic, isn't it? But for me, because the animals and the world around us has taught me how to listen to sound, I like to play duets with them, Yet it's a part of a language of trying to create a landscape, a surrealist landscape that becomes dreamlike. And so part of that is to use the nature sounds, manipulating them into a place where they become psychological, not photographic.
Is there something we should play that maybe exemplifies that pretty well from what you...
Sure. Actually, let's see. Could, in fact, play... Oh, do you have Sunyata on there?
Yeah.
Cool.
We do. Oak Spirits. I mean, why
Instead
not?
Instead of that,
Oh.
why don't you play... do you have trances and drones in there? Play Sunyata Emptiness, if you have trances drones.
Yep.
Okay. This is actually on my first album, and it's layers of flute, my voice, and the frogs in the rain, basically. And it'll take a while to build up because my music was very patient back then.
Yeah, this track is 23 minutes long.
You won't hear the
so
whole
we
thing.
may be here a while.
We could get a little more gain out of this. Oh, thanks. So perhaps people start to understand why I'm distinguishing it from the Brahms lullabies with bird songs behind it.
Another distinction that you constantly make is it's not ambient. It's deep listening. Or, sorry, a phrase that you like to describe what you
I'm way more comfortable with ambient than you know,
some people.
The word that sounds like sewage, yeah. But, you know, we back in the 80s and 90s, there was really no way of putting what myself and other people in my sort of little clique of friends that were doing stuff like this. Most of us were starting really solitary. This was after the German krautrock space music scene in the 70s, and there really wasn't any place for this kind of thing in the 80s. So most of us were working as hermits, you know. But as far as terminology goes, I've always liked Pauline's approach with the word deep listening because
Pauline Oliveros.
Pauline Oliveros, yeah. Because it refers to the listener, not to the sound. It's almost a set of instructions saying, here's how you can approach this. Here's how you can get some nutrition out of it, as opposed to saying, here's what it resembles. And it avoids that problem that, for example, you know, electronic dance music has run into, which is having to come up with a different subgenre every time somebody changes the BPM by 5 points. You know, oh, this is jungle. No, it's not. It's gabber. It's like, you know, this is psytrance. No, it's dubstep. You know, somebody changes the kick drum sample they use and they have to come up with a different term for it. It's ridiculous. I think that the point of finding names for styles is degenerate, and it's really a kind of way of not evaluating what the music is on its own. But the difficulty in trying to sell your music or to convey to people that they might be interested in it usually involves language at some level or another, even though the music itself might be trying to completely subjugate language or subvert language. And yeah.
One of the things that you just mentioned is that you were kind of, all of these people were working as hermits. You know, there didn't seem to be a community, but there was a radio show called Hearts of Space that was a community in a way.
Well, it was a guy,
things.
Stephen Hill. Yeah. And
Can
it was
you talk about what that is and how that played a role in your career?
Yeah, well, Stephen was another Bay Area installation. He came to the San Francisco Bay Area in 1972, I think, right out of architecture school in Pennsylvania, and landed right in the post-hippie scene in San Francisco, and started a radio show on KPFA, that same station, which I grew up listening to. And he would play, he started in the 70s, he was on Thursday nights from 11 till midnight. Or actually, no, he was about 3 hours, so it was like from 10 until midnight or something. And then he moved it to Sunday night, which was a really good spot. And back in the 70s, it would be Klaus Schulze, Popol Vuh, classical Indian music, Paul Horn in the Pyramid, Terry Riley, and everything in between. You know, when Eno started doing Ambient 1 and 2 and all of those things, that was staple.
And there was nothing else like this on the radio.
There really wasn't, not in California, that's for sure. And there were only a couple shows. You know, there was Forrest's show, Musical Star Streams, that was playing more rock-oriented electronic music, which was more in that kind of Tangerine Dream school of sequencers and things. But this, what Stephen was calling space music, which really, I think, refers better to inner space rather than cosmic outer space. It also would cross over into what was an honest New Age culture at the time, which I didn't have anything to do with, being a 17-year-old punk, industrial-influenced, experimentally minded weirdo. I thought that the sort of New Age scene was at least honest. It had a kind of post-hippie veracity to it. But I couldn't stand the sort of frilly, rainbows and unicorns and crystal stuff. But yet some of the music that was coming out of that, like Yassos, for example, although it was calling itself interdimensional, music from some cult or another, it was often really pretty good in its own way. This was before New Age became really more of a new word for easy listening, when we started getting the John Teshes and things like that, which is when we all started really trying to avert our, distance ourselves as far as we could from those labels. But there wasn't a culture of, there wasn't a bin in the record store at the time for this. You'd go to the rock section to find Tangerine Dream, but you'd go to the classical section to find Terry Riley. It didn't really make much sense, and it never has to this day. I think that it's always been a music in the fringes. It tends to be, like most introverted art forms, tends not to be a dominant paradigm. And I think that what you were saying, to get back to your question about hermits, the lovely quote of David Allen from Gong has a poem where he quotes, "We are a community of hermits." And when we got to know Stephen Hill, because he was the only person playing our music, we didn't know each other. These are people like Michael Stearns, Steve Roach, Jeff Granke became a good friend of mine. He was a bit more on the art side of things. And some of the folks in Germany, Parsons, I forgot his first name. No, he was in New Zealand, actually. And anyway, the point being that we didn't know each other, but the fact that there was this one DJ willing to play this kind of music, he put us in touch with each other. So I was doing a sound installation in Los Angeles in 1985 for a Somerset Maugham play, and he said, "Oh, while you're down there, you should meet this guy, Steve Roach." I'd never heard of Steve Roach, except maybe a few pieces of his on Stephen's show. So Steve Roach and I got together for lunch, and we found we had all sorts of things in common. We both had pet iguanas, and we were Hawkwind fans. So that was good enough for us.
Need to explore that iguana connection a little bit further. Yeah. And at a certain point with the radio show, he started a record label, and you were one of the, I guess, first 5 or 6 releases on it.
Yeah, I think 1989 he put out my album Rainforest. He had been playing my other albums, which had been coming out in Europe at the time, in Sweden and France, and he didn't feel any of them were commercial enough for him. And he was trying to make money, which, I can understand. But I would send him the stuff as I was working on it. And this album in '88, I had finished, called Rainforest. He said, "I would love to release this if you're interested." And it turned out to be one of his best-selling albums at that time, and certainly my best-selling album of all times before or since.
Why do you think that one resonated in particular? Or was it just the marketing?
It was a perfect storm, I think, because I was in a state of extreme depression about the state of the planet. And I sometimes go into these big funks about the fact that we're destroying ourselves very quickly. And I mean, the planet will be fine once it gets rid of us, but it's our own species that we're doing a pretty good job of it right now. And so it was that concern about deforestation, and truly I was donating some of the sales to the Rainforest Action Network, which was trying to fix some things in Brazil and in Borneo. So maybe that hit a little bit of a wave of interest. But I think there was also that tiny little moment where independent labels could still get shelf space without having to pay for it. And when there was a cross marketing that could work without having to put names on music, where the New Age audience could find it and the space music audience could find it, the old people listening to German krautrock could find it, and the whole thing kind of, it crossed over the different markets accidentally, and they did a good job of taking advantage of it.
Just a couple of minutes ago, you talked about how you were a punk and a weirdo, and I think a lot of people don't really recognize that some of your influences include people like Throbbing Gristle and Hafler Trio and these things. Can you talk a little bit about how that connects to your work and how you might be able to hear it maybe in the attitude?
Well, I mean, I never was much of a punk. I didn't really like aggressive, stance of like the macho stance of guitar chords and that sort of thing. But I was playing in noisy improv groups, and some of the folks in those groups went on to do other interesting things. and I was usually the guy playing the modular synthesizer, making the weird noises that made it all very strange. But they nicknamed me the professor. I was 15 or 16 at the time doing that around 1979, 1980. 17, I guess, in 1980. Yeah, the influence of Throbbing Gristle was twofold, I think. One was that the idea that you didn't have to wait for anybody to tell you that you're any good. You don't need record labels. You can start your own. Just do it. And that was their thing. The whole industrial movement, also like, Cabaret Voltaire and Wire and all those guys that were big influences on me. Part of it was the attitude of DIY, and nobody has to tell you that you're good or that you know how to play music. If you have something to say it. And the other thing I liked about Throbbing Gristle was that they talked about how music was energy, how music was a form of magic, and how with intention you could direct the energy of music towards a purpose. And music is energy, and it is a substance. It actually is a force that changes things. And that is a shamanic idea, the idea that the intangible can change things. And this is the essence of human creativity, isn't it? When you think an idea for the first time, you've done something that the universe has never done before. You've actually created a new combination of words, a new combination of shapes. And that is miraculous. When you make something, when you make a sculpture, you have added something physical into the world, into the universe that didn't exist. That is an act of creation. It's an act of birth. And that idea that Throbbing Gristle was dealing with about music as energy, music as ritual, was very, very powerful. And I think during the 80s, the industrial movement became sort of co-opted as a kind of dance music with Skinny Puppy and where SPK started going and things like that. The more what people think of now as the sort of Nine Inch Nails sound. But back in the late 70s, it was pure experimental, scary weirdness, and that interested me. And so I think my personality wasn't so inclined towards the underbelly, the ugly underbelly of industrial, which was the celebration of only the shadows of human existence. Or if not the celebration, at least the focusing of spotlight upon them. I think my nature is generally one of much more introverted, a little, a bit more shy, and a bit more positive. And so to take those ideas of music as a form of magic, and to take that idea of shamanic ritual, and to use it for community building, and maybe that's the old hippie in me coming out, right? So it's a weird hybrid.
Community seems to be, and community building seems to be a major topic for you. Why is that? Is it like the Bay Area that's coming through there somehow?
Well, not just the Bay Area, because we have communities all over the world, don't we? There's a community of art music and a community of experimental thinking, which is a web that covers the world with nodes sprinkled everywhere. And we become a worldwide, a global community, but also real physical community, and the people next to you, the people in this building right now. I've realized over the years that as our culture is increasingly virtualized, and that more and more people are experiencing their whole life in front of a little 4-inch screen, that we're losing something very fundamental about human existence. And that as that shift, which I'm seeing accelerated where I live in Silicon Valley, I mean, Google is located walking distance from my house.
So you're literally seeing it firsthand.
We are literally seeing it. And I'm literally seeing people becoming hermits surrounded by people. I mean, it's the idea of being isolated in a world that... I run out of words. I get frustrated because really people are shutting themselves off from real experience to have a very delineated and filtered experience, a much smaller experience in this two-dimensional space. Whereas this is real, and we can buy somebody a coffee, buy somebody a tea, Go for a walk. The physicality of human existence is something that as we deny further and further, we allow ourselves to further destroy our planet and our environment because we become less aware of the destruction we're doing. And I think that as we build an awareness, for example, of the food we eat, if we eat more local food, if we eat healthier raised food, we help the actual planet that we're living on and the people who are growing that food. And we create joy with the people we cook with the people we dine with. And that joy is part of this artistic experience that we are interested in as artists or as musicians. And so that continuity for me between making art that's lasting and powerful and transformative and trying to live a life that is continuous with that, contiguous and complementary, so that the actions of growing my own food in my backyard instead of having some stupid lawn, which we do. We put in raised beds and drip irrigation, and we raise lettuce and carrots and broccoli and tomatoes, and we end up giving a lot of food to our neighbors, because we have too much. And that to me is not different from giving a concert for 30 or 40 sleeping people, or making an album, or mastering somebody else's album. I do mastering, and I teach a college class in mastering. And that aspect of teaching and giving back now has been also part of that continuity and part of that community. So, I really, really want to point out the importance of non-virtual, being in this place now, not taking a picture of it. Everybody goes out to dine and they want to take a picture of their food. Just talk to the person you're with. Remember the food, remember the flavor of it. When I was driving in from the airport into Tokyo, this is the first time I've been to Tokyo, my driver, who was working for Red Bull, said, "I'm surprised you're not taking pictures. Everybody else I drive over this bridge is taking pictures." I said, "No, it's beautiful right now. It's moving me. The lights are scintillating in my heart. It's gorgeous. If I'm taking a picture, I'm just seeing it through this little stupid lens, and then I'll have a file on my computer that I'm never going to look at. At least now I'm experiencing something for real, and it's changing me." And that's kind of what I mean.
So how do you square, all of this electronic music that you're making, all of this technology that you're using with these ideas of trying to push back against it?
Well, there's a certain amount of irony because music is non-tangible, isn't it? And it is a sort of virtual experience to a certain extent. But as far as electronics, they're just instruments, right? And I play flutes and I play percussion and piano and guitars, and it's just another instrument. And the electronicness of it is only a way to transform sound, because I want the sound to be energetic and I want it to be surreal. I want it to be something that triggers a memory. And the way to do that is to transform sounds into things that resemble something from a dream, or resemble something you've never heard before, or music from an alien species. And the way to do that is to warp and bend and twist and manipulate.
I wanted to talk about some of the collaborations you've done over the years. You've collaborated with a lot of people. One, I guess, maybe unlikely one is Lustmord. You did something in 1995, I think it was.
Yeah, Stalker.
He comes from this sort of UK throbbing gristle type background.
Just like me, he's old friends of Chris and Cozy.
How did you guys meet up? And how did that collaboration happen? Because it seems like an unlikely partnership.
Yeah, it was very silly. I did an interview with a magazine around 1993, and they asked me one question, which was, "What sorts of music do you enjoy that isn't like the kind you make?" I said, "Well, lately I've been enjoying stuff that Hafler Trio's done, and Soviet France they had just come out with an album called Shouting at the Ground, which I thought was pretty brilliant." And I mentioned Lustmord's Heresy was pretty good, and I really enjoyed that one. And a couple other things I mentioned that was in that territory of noise music, or of more dark ambient, I guess is the term now. And about 6 months or 8 months later, it comes out in the magazine, and I get a phone call with a funny Welshman's accent, and he says, "Oh, hi, you probably don't know me, but this is Brian Williams, and I go with the name Lusmord, and I saw you mention me in this article, and I got your phone number. I'm quite flattered. I like your music too." And it's like, really? I'd never expected that he would have been listening to, new age music, and we found a huge common ground because we're both audiophiles. We both love big, deep, engulfing sound. And we had fondness for a lot of similar approaches to sound. I mean, it's not as odd a match as you would think. He's also just a very nice person to be around. I mean, he's not brooding and dark and, gothy like you'd think from the music.
You said you're both big audiophiles, and you also mentioned mastering engineering. How did you get into that aspect of things?
Well, as being a control freak, as if anybody here who was over, I try to be nice about it, but I'm super organized, a little bit nerdy about my sound and my setup, and when I tour, I am like, my own sound engineer, and I've just always been a perfectionist that way. It's my personality. And so when I started releasing albums on Hearts of Space, it was the first time I ever had access to like the idea that the stuff was going to have a decent mastering engineer. And I wanted to be there because I wanted to learn everything that was going on, but also wanted to make sure he didn't screw up because I want control. And so the person who was doing all the mastering for Hearts of Space was a fellow named Bob Olson. And Bob had worked at Motown for the 10 years they were in Detroit. He had engineered the first Stevie Wonder albums and Marvin Gaye and just all sorts of famous Motown albums. And when Motown left Detroit and moved to Los Angeles, he came out to San Francisco and became very good friends with Stephen Hill back in the 70s and was the mastering engineer for all of the Hearts of Space albums. So Bob and I got along like wildfire. I mean, I basically was always sitting in with my mastering sessions, asking questions, telling him what I wanted. And he became my mentor, as it were. And I was very lucky to have somebody who really had his the old school history of recording in his soul. And
what were the particular things that you were very focused on making sure sounded right? Was it?
I wanted to make sure that things weren't too loud or too bright, and that the fades were really slow. And I was just meticulous, that there was a certain sound I wanted that you could describe as being, more brown. I didn't want it to be yellow. I wanted it to be sepia and warm and kind of slightly not veiled, because I wanted this scintillating top end, but I was composing with tonalities that were filling out frequency spaces that I wanted to be very specific. And he completely respected that. And when he left for Nashville in the late 90s, I ended up taking over his mastering work for Hearts of Space. By that time, by around 1995, people were coming to me to ask me to work on their albums. Jeff Granke had me remaster some of his old releases. A Produce, who's now passed away, Barry Craig, I mastered most of his albums. And then started going into a lot of the sort of ethereal goth, a lot of the project stuff, Love Spirals Downwards, and so it wasn't just ambient. At this point now, it's been a lot of styles of music.
What are the things that you see like young musicians doing, quote unquote, wrong that you're helping out in the mastering process? Is there anything that you continually see that they could learn? Well,
as a mastering engineer, the thing that I'm always going on and on about is not to fight the loudness wars. There's no winning that war. It's like a nuclear arms race. Step off the rail on that one. Just get off the stairs, because loudness doesn't make it better. Loudness comes from the big thing that says volume on your amplifier, and resolution goes downwards into silence. It's quiet. That stuff sounds better because of dynamic range, and that the listener is who decides how loud it gets. So the loudness thing is one thing, especially with electronic dance music. Things are so smashed. Man, have you heard some of the last Skrillex albums? They're unlistenable. I mean, just there was less dynamic range than full-on white noise. So yeah, that's the first thing. But also, to leave space for the different frequencies, to allow your production to stretch into experiential realms. So you say, I'm going to choose this instrument because it does something in this frequency range. And that's part of orchestration. That's what old school orchestration is. You get the horns to do something here because you want that frequency range to fill in a certain experience. I love deep, low end, but you don't want it to be there all the time. You want to show people you have it and then take it away and then show them you have it again. So that the speakers aren't always working, but when they give it to you, they'll really give it to you. That way, there's dynamic range, and that low end can really speak, all that kind of stuff. But even more important, I think, from a production and creation side of it, is to break out of structures. A lot of the software and the tools suggest ways of working, like keeping your tempo the same all the time, keeping everything in bar lines, blocking out your stuff into verse and chorus and bridge and different kinds of block structures. That's artificial. Musicians don't think that way. If somebody's going to take a solo for an extra bridge and a half, you can bend with it and you can make the music so much more fluid and poetic by not letting the software dictate your decisions. And so much electronic music, and even now acoustic and electric pop music, is built in block structures. It's like Lego, and it's so predictable, and it's really, really boring. Go back and listen to some supposedly very predictable songs from a pop group like Crowded House, and you'll find that they'll have a verse that's only 3 lines long, and then they'll suddenly jump into a totally different part of the song. And it's surprising, and it's fun, and it's much more organic. And that comes from writing with people and being human about your ideas and not letting the software impose structure. So that's a few suggestions.
One of the things you've talked about in the past also I find quite interesting is that you actually don't know a ton of instruments. That limitation is really helpful for you. It's not about, you're obviously someone who's really into gear in a way.
Less than you'd think, but yeah,
but
to a certain extent.
In a way, yeah. You're not into gear because it's infinite possibility is actually quite terrible.
Limitation is the best thing you could possibly have in your creative life. Endless choices is self-destruction. Just remember that and you'll be fine. Really, really, really put things away and don't look at them. Pick 1 or 2 things and make an album with it. It's so much easier. But yeah, I feel like I'm faking it almost all the time. Every time I'm trying to...
Really?
Really.
Why?
Because I'm not a musician. I can't read music. I can't write music. I can't play anybody else's music. If somebody wants me to sit in for a 12-bar blues jam, I'll be in there like I'll play drums because I don't know what to do. I mean, it's like, oh, I think it's supposed to go down here now, but it's really... From the very beginning, I started out as with the intention of being a sound artist, and I thought that it was just going to be like installations and sculpture and performance art or something. And suddenly I had to figure out what a chord was and what a minor key or a mode or what's a diminished. And it's all self-taught. And so it put me around some real musicians, and I really shut up. I'm not kidding. I'm faking it.
In the past, though, you have been making samples, I guess, for libraries and other things to do with technology.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a good income. I mean, part of it is that one of my rules for my own music, and this is related to that previous question, was instead of using sample libraries, I make all of my own sounds. So I only have a few sounds, but I made them all. It gives my music a specific sound. It sounds like me. I don't need to sound like everybody else. I don't care if I have the best cello sample in the world. If I want cello, I'll hire a cellist. I want the sound to be something that I did, because it's real. And so after years of doing that, people I knew, I happened to know a lot of folks that were in synthesizer companies back in the late 70s and early 80s at Sequential Circuits and EMU. And they knew I could do this, and they started coming to me asking for samples. And so back in the early 80s, I did a bunch of sound design for the Prophet 5 presets. And then the EMU Proteus modules, They knew I had a bunch of weird ethnic instruments, udu drums and things with rubber bands and things, and they asked me if I could do a sample library for what became the Proteus 3 World module back in, wow, long time ago now, 1993.
This was through Rick?
Rick Davies was a very good friend at Sequential Circuits. I didn't know you knew that, yeah. You did your research.
And we had Dave Smith here actually earlier this week.
And I was playing in a band with Rick Davies and Andrew McGowan. Andrew played bass on Rainforest, and he played bass in my group Amoeba. And back in 1982, we were in a group together called Urdu. And if you had seen me on stage singing and looping in Urdu, you would worry for my sanity, really. I think people thought I was psychotic. Might be just a little bit, I don't know. But yeah, so Andrew and his wife Joanne basically became the entire front office for Dave Smith Instruments. And I knew Dave back when I was a 16-year-old hanging around with his employees at Sequential Circuits, the weirdo who, I got a Prophet 5 that had been a reject that I could keep working barely, and that was my synthesizer.
These were the early Prophet 5s, and they were...
Rev 1, yeah. This might be really boring tech talk for you guys, but the Sequential Circuits, their very first product was like a sequencer voltage memory, but then I became friends with a bunch of local guys that were working there. The company was really loose. It was like 40 people, and they were mostly musicians that barely knew electronics. And so the Prophet 5, which was the first polyphonic digital synthesizer, it was analog, but a digital controlled synthesizer with memory, in other words. The Rev 1 was a lemon. It was basically a prototype that they made 400 of. And it was point-to-point soldering to fix problems on the circuit board. There was glue on places to keep things from falling. It was just a wreck. And so as soon as they could get one that wouldn't break when you looked at it, the Rev 2, the Rev 1, by the way, they were selling for $6,000 in 1978. Really a lot of money. And so then for a mere $1,500, they got all of those professional musicians who already paid $5,000 or something to get one that worked. And so then they took all of the old lemons back in and they sold them to their employees for $500. And that's how I got my first decent synthesizer.
I mean, those synths were smoking. They were catching on fire.
The Rev 1 had a problem they called the green caps. And if you've ever done any circuitry, there's something called a shunt capacitor that goes on the ground line between the positive and the ground to filter out the DC noise on the line. And most capacitors, when they fail open. Well, the green caps, unfortunately, had a high failure rate, and they all failed shorted instead of open, which meant smoke. Really, really bad. Power supplies would actually blow up because you were just basically putting a screwdriver across the rails. So it's just really a disaster. And it wasn't their fault. They just had a bad bunch of caps.
So you got the version 2?
No, I had a Rev 1.
Oh, you had the version 1.
My first one was Joe
things.
Zawinul's, and it barely worked. It was so bad. And so the next one I had was what's his name? Michael Bodeker's that he traded in. Yeah, so my first recordings were made, actually, not my very first recordings, but the Michael Bodeker Prophet 5 Rev 1 was the one I used until I sold it.
What are you using nowadays to make music?
It's really kind of boring, isn't it? I mean, it's just stuff. Stuff changes. I use a lot of, I'll make samples out of things I record, and I'll mangle them and slow them down and stretch them out and do stuff and make it sound different. I kind of have a reputation for being a modular synth guy, and that's because a guy who started a modular synth company in the 1990s was a fan of my music, and he said, "Would you like to write a review of my MOTM modular?" And I said, "Sure." I was right. By the way, this is another life lesson for anybody who's going to be a professional musician. Keep doing everything that makes money. Say yes to everything, because if anybody comes to you with an offer to make money, it's going to be like rare, right? So one of the things I was doing to make money was writing articles for these music magazines, like Electronic Musician and Home Studio Recording and all of those things back in the 80s and 90s. And I was writing reviews for Electronic Musician, and he asked the editor if they could have me write the review of his modular. It was a ploy on his part because he was a fan of mine and he wanted to meet me, which is no big deal. I'm not elusive. And he also wanted me to start beta testing his new modules, and he basically let me keep the stuff I had after I did the review. And then, lo and behold, with a little dirty look from the editors of the magazine, 2 years later, you'd see me at NAMM demoing the darn stuff. So Paul Schreiber is the guy who builds MOTM modulars, synthesis technology. He kind of, well, my wife says that I'm his trained monkey at NAMM shows. I try to make his modulars sound good so that people will buy them. I've worked my way into a rather large modular system by helping to design some of the modules with concepts and with for something called the cloud. I'm sorry, what is it? The morphing terrarium is one of the modules where I designed all of the wave cycles. So it's a digital waveform oscillator that's analog controlled, and it has 192 single cycle waveforms in them, and I spent a month or two creating all of the waveforms. And so, you end up with a lot of analog modular stuff, and it looks nice, it blinks and makes weird sounds. And and so I get a reputation for that. This is how it grows.
What do you like about modular synthesizers so much?
I like it that there's no lines, that there's no rules. You plug anything into anything else, it can go squish. It's like clay, really. I mean, once you get familiar with, and it's also my first instrument. When I was 13, I started building modular kits because I wasn't a rich kid. I made the money from paper routes and gardening and babysitting and things. And
there was this company called Paya, right?
Yeah, that's the stuff. It was horrible. And you could, for $35, you could get an oscillator kit, and for $27, you could get a VCA or an envelope, and the stuff barely worked. You could really not make music with it. But in 1976, 77, 78, I would build it like one kit a month with paper route money, and after a year or two, I had like a wall of stuff that sounded bad, but it made noise. In fact, we can do it. Let's not talk for a few moments, and if you could play Premonitions. Let's see, I think it'd be the side 2 of the first record is a piece called Sculpture as Low Sounds. It's collage for low noises, or collage for low noise. So jump about like 5 minutes into this or something. There, that's fine. So this was before I had the Prophet 5. I was 17 when I did this. This is around 1980. And it's an improvisation live to cassette with home-built electronics. Because the Paya was almost incapable of staying in tune. You immediately give up on the idea of sounding like Klaus Schulze or Tangerine Dream because I didn't have $100,000 to buy the giant wall of Moog like they had, and so it was. You can sort of hear more the Throbbing Gristle influence here too, I guess. So I guess I mentioned this because this is all modular, home-built stuff. And so in some ways, this was my first instrument, aside from like piano or voice or something. And it's just a native language for me.
I could go on for a long time with you, but I want to open up to questions.
Absolutely. Let's do that. Otherwise, it'll become a sleep talker, a sleep concert.
Does anyone have anything that they would like to ask? And is there a microphone around?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Is that?
Hello.
Hold on.
Okay.
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
I was interested about the conception of magic in the music, and some years I've been researching a little bit on rituals and stuff. I wanted to ask you if there's anything you can share with us, like in Occidental magic, that could be good, like to open the conscience in music, and if there's anything that you do or you know that you could share.
Let me see if I can try to. It's a difficult thing to talk about. I would say that there's no rituals that I perform. There's nothing I do in particular. I don't practice any tradition at all, except perhaps meditation of a sort of Sufi sort. But as far as magic is concerned, what I mean is there is a certain type of concentration that creates realities. And this is something that artists learn. And it works in life, and it's a very strange thing. What you do is you concretize something. You make it real in your mind. It's not the same as imagining. It's not the same as creating something in front of you. What it is allowing a homunculus to form, allowing a golem or a landscape to come and become alive, and it starts taking you over. And you allow it in, and you say, okay, it will grow, and I will let it there, and I will observe it grow, and I will let it become conscious. And you could turn this into, it could be described similarly in psychophysiological terms, in that we are creating a subroutine in our brain, which becomes this creative force, right? It's internal. It doesn't have to be all wooey and magical. But it's a metaphor that we can use that has power because our minds work with metaphors, right? So we tell this story, the story of the golem, you know, the medieval rabbi who makes a little boy out of clay and then breathes the word of God into this little, you know, pile of clay, and it gets up and runs off and creates all sorts of mischief. You know, he shouldn't have breathed the secret word into it. You know, it's this is what art is. And so just like the story of the golem, like the mistake that rabbi made, he did not have humility. To practice this kind of magic, we need to take full humility and we need to take full ownership for our actions. And that's why in my own life, I've decided to take a path of more of a gentle music and of a nonviolent and a more communal minded, because I own my actions, because these golems that I release, these homunculi, they can go off and do all sorts of damage. And so I need to impart within them the best energy that I can. But when I create an album, it waits to be created. What happens is I'm not making it from my ego. I'm waiting until the album forms a thing. And that thing is real before I even start making sound. And then what I do is I'm working to create notes that resemble the world that is making itself happen in my head. And I try to approximate the thing so that it can come out into that music. I'm reciting, in other words, I'm taking dictation. But it's not like Mozart. I mean, Mozart says that he was writing as fast as he could. He probably was, because he was insanely inspired. I mean, for somebody to write that much music in a short life. It's harder for me. My form of dictation is experimenting until it sounds something like what the world is telling me, what the homunculus, what the golem is saying to me. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, this album doesn't sound like that. This album sounds like this. You need it to be wetter. You need it to be drier. You need it to be higher, lower. And I go, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do this. So I say I'm a faker, because most of the time I don't know how to write the notes down. I'm just trying to take dictation. But the first key is to follow the why. And this is another aspect of magic, is to know purpose first. If you have purpose, then you have direction, and then you know the questions to ask, and the questions are far more important than the answers. The answers just come out.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Hello. Thanks for your lecture.
Yeah.
You talked about TGs like earlier in your lecture. I recently saw Psychic TV live in Paris, and Genesis Purage was talking about trance state encountered in Africa in a recent trip. What's your mind what's your point of view about trance? Is it a state that you want the listener to reach while listening to your music? Is it a state that you try to reach while making your music? What's your point of view about trance in music?
I think that music and trance are completely tied in very closely together, and music is a language that grew up, I think, out of ritual and shamanism and trance. And if you look at the way it's used in many cultures still to this day, you could call it, hypnosis if you want to be Western or scientific about it. The roles of drone and repetition are immensely important in these questions. But there are, just like there are in drugs, in exogenous influences of psychic phenomenon, there are endogenous influences of psychic phenomenon that we build ourselves. And we could say that they're chemical, but they're also at many other levels. Just like drugs can be soporific or enhancing, they can be uppers or downers, let's say, so can trances. So there are less productive forms, in my mind. I'm being judgmental here, so excuse the judgmental terminology. But my own feelings in my life have come to the point where I feel that the trances that involve overstimulation are less useful than the ones that involve rarefied stimulation, which is why my music is so quiet. I think that the things that go on at psytrance raves are very interesting and they're very powerful, but they're not as nutritious. And what I find is that if you look at the touchstone of the result, if you measure the person's life and the person's utility in life, you'll find that the whispering forms of trance, that the focal, energizing ones create more enhanced life directions in people, and they get more done, and they're more useful. I've seen a lot of burnout cases at Psy raves. So, I mean, it's, you see a bunch of people who can barely form a sentence. I mean, maybe it's just years of DMT use, but it's also like there's a quality of overstimulation where they become incapable of changing the world now. They've changed themselves so much that they're now just a basket case. So, in spiritual disciplines, they'll refer to a center of gravity. You'll see this in Zen, you'll see it in Sufism. And the silent forms of meditation or of trance tend to lower your center of gravity, and they make it hard to push you over. And I mean psychically as well. The high drama, high dynamic range kinds of trance tend to bring your center of gravity up, and they make it very easy to tip you over. And you'll find that people will land into things like schizophrenia and stuff like that, where the balance point is set off kilter. And so I think out of basically becoming an old fart, my own strange kind of radical conservatism is that I think that when we change ourselves, we need to do it with that center of gravity, There's a couple questions still trying to, this microphone's moving its way around.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks to be there. My question is, have you been ever influenced by different artists coming from concrete music, like Pierre-Henry, for example, or Fluxus movement in contemporary art with all these artists who actually work a lot with sounds?
Not so much directly, although certainly the history of Pierre-Henry and people like that are extremely essential for the history of recorded music. And I would say that it hasn't directly influenced me. There's one, some of the Fluxus artists have influenced me more, though. My joke about Yoko Ono is the Beatles destroyed Yoko. It's like she was doing brilliant work before she met John. Actually, Marcel Duchamp, I think, it would be the spiritual progenitor of the Fluxus, and I think his work is very influential for me. But oddly, there was one Fluxus performer who influenced the Sleep concerts. I haven't read my own interviews in a while. I'm forgetting his name. Sometimes when you're talking, it's hard to think. But he would put whistles in his mouth, and he would sit on a hammock and fall asleep in front of an audience, and his sleeping would cause the whistles to blow back and forth. and so I thought that's kind of a lazy way to do it. We should at least get some work, you know. So, but yeah, I think that stuff is situational art and Dada and surrealism and installation art. All of those things are very, very important for me.
Yeah, one thing we didn't touch on, I guess, is the sculpture and visual art and these other things play as big of a role, it seems like.
For me, big time. Yeah, it's a huge... I started out thinking I was more of a visual artist than a sound artist. And I used to draw and paint a lot when I was little. But I was never satisfied because it was too physical, and I wanted to paint my dreams and to paint my hallucinations, because I would have these vivid living hallucinations. But I hated my paintings because they were still, they weren't the energy that was in my brain. But what I found was that music could give me those vibrant hallucinations directly, and I felt that it would make more sense to try to give them to people inside of themselves rather than to just try to represent what I did. And that was more of the activating principle. But yeah, so it definitely came from a visual art thing, but in some ways, a living painting, of an imaginary painting. Yeah, there's a microphone back there. Move it over this way. And you're still stranded over here.
Thank you, Mr. Rich, for being here. I got a couple of questions, actually. First one is, you told us you grew up in San Francisco. You're really next to this Grateful Dead band, and that you're this audiophile. You love working with speakers, big speakers, being surrounded by music. I always got like this fixation with this character around the Grateful Dead crew that everybody calls him like the bear. You know, he...
Oh, Owsley?
Yeah, Owsley.
Well, they just liked him because he was making the acid.
No, but I know. But what I read is that he actually constructed them speakers from the...
He built some of the first ones, but they weren't as good as history pretends. And Dan Healy was the sound guy that made them sound good. So Owsley built some of the very first speakers, and Dan Healy built some of the amplifiers and also some of the cabinets. And they both really... there were several different teams of people within the rock and roll history that invented the PA system. I mean, really like the rock and roll sound system. The guys who were touring with the early version of Fleetwood Mac, actually the Peter Green version of Fleetwood Mac, also were some of the very first PA systems ever. And Dan Healy and Owsley's PAs for the Dead. Also, we mustn't forget the name, which I've forgotten. Sorry, John. Their current, he's got John Meyer, and since like 1980, the Dead were using Meyer sound, and John Meyer has a major company now. So, and he was doing all their sound systems throughout the 90s. So, but yeah, there's a big team of people with a group like that. And with rock and roll PA systems, you're dealing with a whole other level of power and focal point and feedback suppression. I don't know a thing about that world.
And my second question was about in Peru, in these ayahuasca sessions, they got these beautiful litanies called Icaros, I was asking if you had worked with that, know about that, how would that influence you,
I've never done one of those shamanic sessions personally. I know people who actually went to Peru to work with shaman in ayahuasca ceremonies. I think for me, it's not, I think the drugs become a displacement, and also we can too easily attach ourselves to various cultural traditions which are different from our own. And it's important, I think, not to graft traditions inaccurately or inappropriately between cultures. And part of the reason for doing the kind of music I do, and I said I would get back to it early in this long talk, one of the purposes of the Sleep Concert and this idea of ritual was to try to find a way to create a sort of grounding ritual that was communal and public, but yet was modern and 20th or 21st century and could work conceptually with our technological and scientific worldview, and that didn't require a sort of credulousness in a certain realm. I mean, in other words, I don't have to believe that I'm riding the leopard with coyote. You know, I don't have to touch the snake. You know, the language of shamanic ritual is very specific to each culture. And our culture has a new language. And so we need a new ritual, one that's appropriate to us. And I don't know what it is yet. I'm still looking.
You've worked with other cultures, their music in your own. I'm wondering if you maybe talk about some of the ones that you have and why you felt that they have been special to your language, your musical language.
Yeah, I'll try to say it really quickly, is that I think I just gravitate towards the sound of a certain way of using melody and drone. And it's a sound, if you just look at an arc that goes from North Africa across Persia and Eastern Europe and down across North India into Indonesia, you've got an influence which has been carried since the Muslim revolution in the 600s, but it came before then. And there's a language that's very ancient. You can even hear it in Coptic Ethiopian, and you can hear it in pre-Muslim Himalayan music. There was a way of using melody that relates to ecstasy. And when Islamic music found that within their own culture, they carried it around to other cultures, and so you find it elsewhere. But it's universal and it's very human. And that's what gets me. It's when a melody starts doing things to my brain that change me. And it's the energy. It's a very pure, very direct communication. And so my friendships with Indian musicians and with some Eastern European musicians, and there's just, if they can get that sound, that's all I'm looking for. It's what I'm always trying to find. It's why I play the instruments I do when I'm playing flute or lap steel guitar. I'm just searching for it, and I don't have the right training. But I'm really, I mean, that's my honey.
Hi. Okay, so you know about frequencies. I really like drone music. I really like microtonal. I like microtones. I like dissonance and just all, vibrations in music. And I was just talking to Nick recently about this, actually. At one point, in more like religious contexts, like hundreds or thousands of years ago, when religious music, they kind of found the frequencies that would, maybe more enchanting, that would affect people, like chakra systems or things of that nature in a positive way, or they could see the effects of these frequencies on people. And I feel like, and I don't know enough about this, but at some point, the churches, they kind of realized the control they could have over people and found these certain frequency ranges that kind of became oppressive, actually, and have become like the main scale of Western music now. And I think about that a lot because in Western music, you have your very specific 440 is A, all these things, and it kind of omits all these other frequencies that make you feel these other things. That's why I'm drawn to Middle Eastern music a lot and things like that, because it's swaying on these scales and it's very spiritual and it affects me physically in a different way. How do you think about that, or like, what are your feelings about that?
Definitely. It's the history of tuning is fascinating. I also tend to be a bit of a skeptic when people go into things like A440 versus A432 or whatever, because it's a continuum. It's like you're just tuning a different A. I mean, it's like, so what? It's a sharp A flat at that point, right? So I tend to be, there's a certain scientific undercurrent in my thinking as well, and so when people go towards this way of thinking where a certain frequency changes a certain chakra or a certain chord is the sacred chord, I find this to be claustrophobic and not right or wrong, but just limiting. It's a box that we don't need. What I love is expressive, ecstatic relationships between frequencies, and they're all over the place. And there's relationships that are out there, and the relationships are rather simple to understand. They relate to the harmonic series, which is simple math. It's the way that consonant intervals relate with overtones, right? So once we make that observation that we've got whole numbered ratios, we have an infinite number of whole numbered ratios, right? So now we can play around, and it just expands our playground. We have a big sandbox we can make castles with, and we can build them up and tear them down, and it's a beautiful thing. So I don't feel that there's one right tuning, one wrong tuning. I don't think that there's a right or a wrong way to do anything. I just love expressive human creation. And to me, microtonal, or just intonation in particular, gives me a wider palette of colors. And I find that to be more expressive. I personally love the way a 7/4 sounds. It's my favorite interval. So
Thank you.
Yeah. There's 2 there and 2 back there.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
You mentioned inner space before, and I wanted to ask you, what's your take of James Graham Ballard's take on inner space? That it's something that includes our perversions and our negative aspects of our minds, as opposed to what you were referring to, the things that connect listeners or the creators with the listeners, and all that.
So what's the writer's name again? Graham Ballard?
J.G. Ballard.
J.G. Ballard. Oh,
yeah, I'm sorry,
a huge,
excuse me.
no, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry, my accent is...
No, that's okay.
I'm sorry, it's
My problem.
worse.
I'm a big fan of J.G. Ballard, but he's also a very hurt soul. I mean, he had a really rough childhood.
Yeah, but this juxtaposition between that Ballard defined inner space as something awful in a way,
Yeah.
as opposed to what you were saying.
That's true.
About,
And the funny thing is, I love Ballard's writing because he also has such an expansive way of creating that sense of loneliness of his heroes. They're always so stranded and so lost. But, that's because everybody has their own life experience, and his story started with a very dark set of underpinnings. But he grew up in a prison camp during World War II, so it's the distinction or the judging of good or bad and inner or outer, I think, are problematic. And when we look at the human character, we see that it's full of light and full of dark, and they're all intertwined and almost inseparable. And I think that's really what Ballard was saying, is that great humanity, great kindness can be enfolded with great cruelty, just as birth and death are part of the same process. I think that maybe as an indirect way to answer that, I'll describe a piece that Anea Lockwood did that moved me very, very deeply. And I think this might encompass this idea of birth and death. She referenced an Ashona ritual in Ghanaian culture that where when a child is born, they would find a certain branch of an acacia tree that splits apart, and then because the tree grows funny, it grows back together again. And they would separate that branch out from the tree and when the mother is pregnant. And when the baby is born, if the baby lives, they break that circle of branch apart and keep it with that child for the duration of his or her life. When that person dies, 20, 50, 80 years later, in the burial ritual, that stick, which is part of their collection of life possessions, is buried with them and connected back over their body. What this deals with is this idea that was very common also within the Surrealists, that, and I'm talking in particular about the writer...
Breton?
Not Breton. It was actually... My Google is not working right now. I'll get it. I'll get it back there. But he wrote a lot on death, on sex and death in particular, and the French have a lovely word for orgasm, which is le petit mort, And so this idea, though, that he was Bataille, Georges Bataille, is the writer, And Bataille dealt with the idea of life and death as that life was the discontinuity, that birth is discontinuous and death is a return to continuity. And this Ashona ritual is identical to that, where they're showing that the circle is broken by birth and returned into death. And so when we think about our lives in an egocentric way, we're saying that this separation of us from the universe is defining us, but really what it's doing is that it's defining our death, is that this is a very brief moment of assemblage of structure, and it changes over the course of a lifetime, and then it dissolves again. So Inea Lockwood had done an amazing performance art piece with a friend of hers who was a sculptor and was dying of throat cancer. Or actually, the whole body was taken over by cancer. And she interviewed him just a day before he died. And he could barely speak, his voice was all torn up. And he was talking about coming to terms with death. And she played this recording while intersplicing it with sounds of the forest and chopping wood and walking and just people in a natural environment. And she did this at New Music America in 1980. She sat on the stage, cross-legged. She played this tape for about 25 minutes, and she created one single motion. It took 25 minutes to make. She started with 2 sticks on her lap, and very slowly, 25 minutes later, the 2 sticks were connected at the top of her head. And it was so powerful. I'm even crying right now. It's very, very hard to tell the story because the audience afterwards was silent. The performance showed the answer to your question.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
I have one. Hi, my question will be very mundane after
No
this,
no
I'm
problem.
afraid.
It's okay.
I really enjoyed your story about coming from the airport and trying to enjoy the surroundings by just looking at them and not filter them through your possible camera or phone, whatever. And I was thinking if, do you feel that there is an equivalent to that in music? Like, do you think that live visuals or videos kind of might take away from the sheer enjoyment of
Absolutely. In fact, well, it just
music?
depends on the purpose of the music, I would say. If the purpose is entertainment, if you're trying to create excitement, I mean, if you're doing a pop concert, if you're Beyonce or something like that, you're not going to do some rarefied, thing. You're going to put on a full-on performance. That's what people are paying for. If you want to do something profound, though, you might try pulling away influences, pulling away stimuli. This is my own feeling. It's my own theory about art, not necessarily proven or true. But I feel that when fewer things impinge upon us, they can have a stronger influence, and they'll trigger more activity inside of our creative minds. And each person experiencing it will have potentially a more profound experience because they have to make more of the experience inside of themselves. Art is about creative muscle. It's not about handing somebody a basket full of eggs. This is a strange metaphor, but play with me here. Essentially, in our culture, we assume that an artistic act puts information into a box and then it conveys that information to people. It's like a basket of eggs. Little Red Riding Hood is coming to take cookies to her grandmother. So let's imagine that's completely irrelevant, and let's come up with a metaphor that's perpendicular to this, not making it wrong or right, but just saying maybe it's something else. What if, in fact, art is exercising a muscle, and there's a truth muscle, a beauty muscle, an anger muscle, a fear muscle, and these are things in our brains that the more we exercise them, the stronger they get. So if we sit here and watch World News Tonight every night, and we watch all the bombings and diseases and horrors that the governments are causing on each other, we become our fear muscle becomes very powerful, very strong, and we become more angry, and we act in ways that are like a mouse hiding from the world, right? And we vote in ways that react according to fear. We treat other people according to those rules of fear. So as artists, if we can exercise different muscles, perhaps we can strengthen ways of behaving. It's a little bit like if you're an athlete and you hire a personal trainer and they say, before you do anything, I just want you to get out of your car. Don't drive your car. Next time you go shopping, walk to the store. So you find yourself wasting all this time walking to the store and you're getting something else done. You're actually getting stronger while you're getting your bread and carrots, you know. So one thing might differentiate from another action. It might sound like it's doing something different, but in fact it might be causing action in several different layers. It's how all the stories like in Zen of the teacher getting people to you know, there's a lovely Sufi phrase, if you have no troubles, buy a goat. It's because goats are a pain in the butt, right? So it's good for you. My point is that if you look at how multimedia impinges upon our senses and creates overstimulation, and which can be a form of trance, relating to that question back there, that kind of overstimulated trance can create a very numbing effect on the brain, and it creates a shutdown. And what we do is we become very used to filling in all of the gaps with sensory information and not actually creating more ourselves. And so if we want to stimulate people, instead of just turn them into zombies, what we can do is start thinning out the information so that we do little pinpricks, you know, and remove things, and then start exciting their own muscles. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Got a question back there.
Hi, I have a couple of questions.
Oh.
One is like, I'm a big fan of industrial music and Throbbing Gristle and the whole idea of Genesis Peerage, the temple of psychic youth and everything. So it's not that clear that if even you read all the text and everything, that do you think that these guys, the industrial musicians, were they work with the term of magic? Because I think that those guys were the ones that after the Second World War, I mean, in a globalized world, they embraced this idea of death, and they were working with, I don't know, magic for them is like, as you said with this performance you were describing. Do you think that they're like, I kind of want to know why they got to that point, like when they like ritual and techno shamanism, as they were calling it, it's now about like giving significance to things, because in this world we so globalized and virtuality is like, it's I don't know, this lack of spirituality, it needs to be filled with something that in the end is technology, is industrial. The name is like make the direct reference not to nature but to, I don't know, factories or post-war stuff. Do you think that it's like fair to say that magic nowadays has more to do like with this technological and hyper-real environment more than how it used to be like in I don't know, many years ago, or with other cultures?
I think it's choices we make. And I think one of the main points, although it's true that industrial culture, industrial art, you know, psychic TV, Throbbing Gristle, all those folks in general, specifically, I think Genesis Peerage's fascination with the kind of satanic cult ritual sort of stuff, you know, for lack of a better word, which I find kind of childish, just kind of silly, to be honest. I don't find it evil or anything. I just kind of goofy. I think that what it refers to is that personal choice directs your direction, and it's an act of free will. And so Genesis's particular decision to focus on the macabre, or the death side of things, the thanatos, the death urge, you know, is a personal direction that is natural to his inclination. you find that when Throbbing Gristle broke up and when Chris and Cozy went their own way, they had a very different energy, a much more positive energy. But coming from that same idea of music as energy, right? Music as a potential transformative medium, but yet not obsessing over the thanatotic, but rather choosing to direct energies into places where they can actually be functional. And again, I encourage you to use what in spirituality they call the touchstone. What results in the personality of the people who are practicing something? Are they becoming better, or are they becoming worn out or decaying in some way? And you'll find that, I'm not making any sort of religious kind of judgment call upon what's good or evil. I don't have any of that. It's not about good and evil. It's about focusing energy towards things that are life-affirming. And we know that life and death are all interfolded, but we can write songs about how, the Nazis killed millions of people with gas chambers, like Zyklon B Zombie, for example. We can write songs about how, a friend of Genesis's had was an orderly in a hospital and, described a patient who was completely burnt, hamburger lady. Or we can create ritual that, in fact, moves people in a direction that gets them to do something to change. Now, the funny thing is that very negative dark magic that he would be sort of more attached to also would work to energize me as a teenager who needed that at that moment. But then I'm not going to sit there and wallow in it. I'm going to use it as a kick in the ass. And it gets me to start doing something to change the world, rather than sitting there and just morosely cocooning into a kind of thanatotic paranoia. So I think that choosing to activate in certain directions, not about right or wrong or good or bad, but in terms of what energizes us to change or do something, and then what keeps us healthy and what keeps us sustaining. I would say that Genesis is probably not the best example of how to live a healthy life. But then.
And then another question, like coming back to the sound part of your work and this this aesthetic. Do you think that granular synthesis, even if it's like, modular synthesis, even if it's on hardware or in Ableton Live or something like that, you were saying like when you were a child you were working like as if it was like clay, right? So I once saw this really monumental performance by Robert Henke, the Thunder Studies of Thunder, and it's like it's more than a concert. It was like a sonic sculpture, right?
His work is great. He's a good friend of mine too, and he's brilliant.
Do you think that in that way, like modular synthesis, since it's not like directly related to a keyboard or like notes and all that? Because I don't know, some musicians are like they don't like to for them to be like in this term or to be encapsulated in this, I don't know, what they call like sonic sculptures. I think that, for example, you making an experience and that which its purpose is to be like reflective with the audience to see like themselves through the mirror you're putting.
So let me just forgive me for cutting you off. I wanted to focus your question. Are you referring to the purpose of the synthesis or the tools themselves?
No, the purpose and the meaning. I mean, like the meaning, like.
So what I would say about that is that the tools are just tools. It's like discussing which is the better hammer or shovel, right? We can discuss this shovel has a point and this shovel has a blunt end. You should use this one to shovel snow, but this one to dig a hole, right? So that's not a very interesting conversation. What's more interesting is why do you want to dig a hole, right? What is that hole going to do for you? And so if you start with the reason for the sound you want to make, then you choose a tool that allows you to direct yourself into that purpose. So you start with the why, and the tool will follow. The tools don't matter. So that's my answer.
So time for one more.
Let's let's
Okay.
see if we can squeeze these two in. There was this comment. Let's see if
Okay, I'll
we
be
can get
brief.
those two in.
You mentioned listening to this radio show in midnight on those halcyon days, and I sum up all the talk about magic and spirituality and toxic media and toxic music, and I think of this show as a Bay Area show, like spreading good vibes to sensitive people.
A bit of that, yeah.
Do you think radio, I'm a radio DJ, do you think radio has a role such as a bell tower in a community spreading the gospel? Do you think there's a responsibility as a DJ to enhance the vibrations of a whole community, of a whole city?
I think it can, especially terrestrial radio, because it's communal. It has a space around it. And the key to me is that your idea of the bell tower reminds me immediately of this sort of idea of a church with a message coming from above down. And what I like about community radio is that it's not like that. It's actually people sharing their passion with other people. And they, like college radio, a bunch of students and a bunch of people who hang out, they share their love of music and they get everybody excited. And it's really a sharing. It's like cooking for each other. And so it's not a bell tower. It's actually, it's a commune. You know, it's something a lot more fun. It's it's a poetry reading. You know what I mean? It's really like a coffee shop. It's not like a high order sacred message. And I much prefer that low level sharing of excitement and passion. So yeah, but I love terrestrial radio, and I hope it survives. The internet is wonderful, but there's no real community when the person who likes your Facebook page is in Greece or Czechoslovakia or China. Or there's a kind of community, a different kind, a good one, and that's excellent because then I can meet those people here. But I doubt that in Japan I'll meet any of my Facebook friends except the ones that I met for this thing. It's like that's so artificial. This is real, and that's what I love. So yeah, one last one there.
I actually think I answered it.
Okay.
Thought it through, and then
What were you thinking?
Well, I was just in relation to that. I was going to ask: did the tools ever guide? So the tool doesn't guide you?
Oh, sure, it does. Sometimes anybody who says it doesn't is lying. But that's one reason why you want to limit your tools. If you have too many tools, then you don't know where to go. What's good is that if you choose to paint in oils on canvas, it will force you to make certain decisions over a certain time range. If you choose to paint in watercolors, you're going to do a certain kind of thing. If you choose to have every one of them right next to you all at once, you're going to not know where to start. So yes, the tools do limit you, and limits are good. But if you start with purpose and then pick a few tools that you can play with, then you'll probably get more done. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Robert, we'll be around if anyone else has questions. But for now, thank you very much, Robert.
Absolutely.
Rich.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.